Welcome to The Shape of Dialogue. Today I'm joined by Professor Johnjoe McFadden from the University of Surrey. Johnjoe is a professor of molecular genetics, specialising in using systems-based approaches to study infectious diseases. He has researched the genetics of microbes and invented a test to diagnose meningitis. Johnjoe has written 4 books on quantum evolution, examining the role of quantum mechanics in life, evolution, and consciousness. In 2006, he co-edited Human Nature, Fact and Fiction on the insights of both science and literature on human nature, with contributions from Ian McEwan, Philip Pullman, Steven Pinker, A.C. Grayling, and others. In 2014, with renowned physicist Jim Alkalele, he co-authored a popular science book, Life on the Edge, The Coming Age of Quantum Biology, exploring quantum biology and recent findings in photosynthesis, enzyme catalysts, avian navigation, olfaction, mutation, and neurobiology. His latest book, Life is Simple, examines how Occam's Razor sets science free from the constraints of religion and mysticism, enabling it to unlock the universe. He has published more than 100 articles in scientific journals on subjects as wide-ranging as bacterial genetics, tuberculosis, idiopathic diseases, and computer modelling of evolution. He has contributed to more than a dozen books and has edited a book on the genetics of mycobacteria. He has also developed a widely reported artificial life computer program modelling evolution in organisms. Professor McFadden regularly writes for the Guardian newspaper on topics such as quantum mechanics, evolution, and genetically modified crops. The context of our discussion is an ongoing investigation into what is and isn't science, and whether indigenous ways of knowing have a scientific basis. And now I give you Professor Johnjoe McFadden. Welcome to The Shape of Dialogue. Today I'm joined by Professor Johnjoe McFadden from the University of Surrey in London. Or England, really. Okay, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today, Johnjoe.
It's a pleasure, Michael.
Yeah. Now, to start, why did you agree to do this podcast with me?
Well, I suppose I was intrigued by an invitation from New Zealand. It's not a country I've visited yet, sadly, and I thought it would be good to find out a little bit more about it and chat to you New Zealanders and tell you about the work and the ideas in my latest book.
Yeah, actually, first of all, tell us about your latest book, because I've started reading it and it's a fantastic read so far.
Yeah, well, it came to me when I was thinking about science, really, and what was the difference between science and all the other stuff that we do, and because there are many other ways of making sense of the world, and science is just one of them, but it has been an extremely powerful one of them. And what makes it this powerful, and lots of things that are generally put forward as being what makes science so special, if you think about it, aren't particularly special to science. For example, experimentation. People have been doing experiments way before science. I mean, the whole agricultural revolution, the Neolithic revolution, must have had lots of experiments in people planting seeds. People who made the first metal objects must have experimented with forges, and every progress that humanity has made must have been made with experimentation. So experimentation isn't necessarily exclusive to science. A famous philosopher, Karl Popper, said disprovability was what science is, and there's some truth in that until you come to, as a scientist, as a practicing scientist myself, and you come to a result in your experiment that disproves your hypothesis, you don't immediately abandon it. In fact, I had one only early today, which I won't be too complicated to tell you about, but I'm not giving up my hypothesis yet. I'm going to fight for it and find out if I can find some way around this disproof. And scientists do that all the time. and it's just as hard to disprove a hypothesis as it is to prove one. And many disproved hypotheses, such as a famous one at the moment, is the cosmological constant, the idea that the universe, that there is some energy in the universe that pushes it apart. Einstein came up with a theory 50 or so years ago, I guess, maybe more, and then abandoned it because it wasn't necessary when it was discovered that the universe was expanding. But then it's come back into fashion when it was discovered that the universe is actually accelerating. So disproved theories come back into fashion, and it's hard to disprove. So that isn't a exclusive criterion to science. And then the other thing that I was kind of shocked by was when I met some very clever and smart creationists, and I'm a strict evolutionist myself, and I came to argue with them about evolution, and I thought, that'd be easy to disprove these guys. They're obviously talking nonsense. And I said, okay, what about fossils? And they say, oh well, that's because they're the animals that were drowned in Noah's flood. And I've heard that one before, so it's ready for an answer. But what about the stratification of fossils as you look through rocks, where you find evolutionary series of fossils like trilobites as you go through the millennia and millions of years? And they said, oh, that's nothing to do with evolution. That's because their bodies, when they were settling down in Noah's flood, they were sorted by hydrological sorting that will treat different bodies differently. So you'll get these layers. So I had that one before, but sounded extremely unlikely. But I thought I'd throw something else at them. Well, yeah, well, you believe that the Earth was this great flood happened about 2000 BC or thereabouts, I think it is. And this was when the pyramids were around, and the pyramid builders would have surely noticed their pyramids being flooded, being drowned under a mile of water, and noticed and talked about it afterwards. But there's no mention of it in the pyramid, as far as we could tell. There's no record of any pyramids being flooded by this great flood. And they said, well, you don't believe radiocarbon dating, do you, for the Egyptian old period? That's completely wrong. And carbon dating is a nonsense. So I found that I could go on and on and on and never disprove them. And this is because they are able to invent explanation after explanation, after explanation, as a kind of towering edifice. That each bit of it, yeah, maybe in a million years that might happen, or maybe this could possibly be happening. And each step makes sense. It's logical. It's not that it's not logical. It's not that it doesn't make sense. What it is in the end is highly improbable because it's too complicated an explanation. So ultimately, I came down to the conclusion that science isn't really about all those other things like experiment or disprovability. It's actually just the simplest way of making sense of the world. You can believe all of this strange things, hydrological sorting, and that radiocarbon dating is wrong, and all this kind of stuff. But that's a complicated explanation. Or you just say that natural selection, simplest theory in the world, variants that are successful. Simple. That's all you need. Natural selection, and you get everything else. That is far simpler than this complicated explanation. But you can't disprove the complicated explanation. This is what I was shocked to find out, and realized that the reason is that nothing can be really disproved, nothing can be proved. All we have is probabilities, and when it comes down to it, probabilities rest on complexity, and the simplest solutions to problems are the most likely to be true.
Your definition that you stated in one of your lectures, I think it was your Royal Institution lecture, was a systematic enterprise that uses logic, mathematics, and experiment to identify the simplest models of the world that provide the most accurate and general predictions.
Yeah.
That is, I've been on a little investigation into what is science. I've been doing a lot of listening and reading on the subject, and that's actually the best definition that I've come across.
Okay, thank you.
Can I get your thoughts on adding one word to it?
Mm-hmm.
I would add a systematic, networked enterprise.
Okay.
I'm reading Jonathan Rauch's Constitution of Knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
and what it made me aware of is how important the network system of science is. And one of the examples he gave was penicillin. And again, who's the guy who discovered
Fleming.
penicillin? Can't remember.
Fleming.
Fleming, that's right.
Fleming.
Yeah, and he discovered it, didn't do anything about it, just wrote a paper, and it was actually 10 years later that 2 American scientists took it up. So, and just reading a bit about your work and seeing the connections that you've made with people, which lead you, which expand and lead you further on down the scientific road. Would you agree with that?
Science is certainly the most collaborative venture on the planet. I don't think there is any even in art and I think politics and other cultural activities, we don't collaborate as much as we do in science. Science depends on collaboration now across the planet. And nearly all the big advances that are made are collaborations involving, probably, if you counted them all, hundreds of people. And I think it is a feature of science, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a defining feature of science. People like Isaac Newton, for example, he worked rather alone and came up with Principia, probably, arguably, the most important book in science ever written, pretty much sitting on his own in his office in Cambridge, and or was it Oxford? Cambridge, and really did it pretty much. And he was the most unsociable person on the planet at the time. He tirade against everyone else, didn't collaborate, considered every other scientist around him as potential competitors. So Leibniz, for instance, he is thought to have even fraudulently written tirades against him under a pseudonym. So
Right.
he wasn't a collaborative person, he wasn't a network person, but he still did darn good science. So I think it is a feature of modern science, and I don't know any modern science that any really big significant finds in modern science in which you get a paper with a single author anymore. But I'm sure
Yes.
I'm sure if I thought hard enough, I'd find some. And I wouldn't say that doesn't make them science. So I think it's a feature, a characteristic of science, but not necessarily its defining feature.
Well, is it in the evolution of science? I mean, now that it's essentially got so complex, I mean, you could say the same thing about Einstein. He sat in a room and did it all by himself, didn't he? But I mean, I can't remember who it was I was listening to. Someone who had received a Nobel Prize, and he was quite disappointed by the Nobel Committee, because he said, sure, I led the team, but it was a team, it was a cast of thousands. And if you say, look at the greatest machine we've ever created, the CERN, the Large Hadron Collider, that is thousands and thousands, thousands of people. And I've heard that there's something like 32 nationalities involved. So the other question I've got is science culturally dependent? Does it span cultures, or is it emanated from one culture? And on that matter, a lot of the accusations we're dealing with in New Zealand with regard to the discourse on science is in quotes Western. Can you talk to that?
Well, it wasn't always Western. There was an awful lot of excellent science done in places like Babylon, in Cairo, in India, and different times have had different parts of the world have had their strengths in science. In South America, science was going on before we knew about it, and in Australia too. Remember, my definition of science is quite broad. It's actually just any activities that make sense of the world. And people were making sense of the world in all cultures. Otherwise, they wouldn't have got to be the cultures that they are today, because they had to overcome things like environmental challenges, communication, um, uh, engineering problems. All of those, when you overcome them using reason, and the kind of logic that I'm talking about, where you look for the simplest possible explanation to stuff, I call that science. So the first people to make pots were scientists. The first people to make bronze were scientists, because they reasoned, okay, well, it must. If this didn't work, let's try something else, and not in an entirely random way. I'm sure they thought about things, and people who, science is broad enough to encompass things like cookery. I mean, people experiment with cookery and say, well, that's not quite turned out right. Something's gone wrong. Maybe something has curdled. Well, what do I know about curdling, and how can I prevent it? Oh, maybe if I add some cream or something. That's science. When you use reason, it's science, and that is then a general activity that all cultures engage in. Now, there is a kind of subset of science that is expensive usually, and is delivers new technologies that transform the world, such as modern electronics, lasers, and stuff like that. That, because these are recent inventions, they are a product of Western science. But buttons were an old invention. They were a product of Arabic science, but they're still a product of science. So all cultures make
Did you say
buttons? Buttons.
Sorry, did you say buttons?
Buttons.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
These things on my coat there. The Arabs
Did you say they're Arabic? I didn't know that.
invented them. Quinine was used to treat malaria by ancient people. Well, not so ancient in South America, and discovered by the Jesuits. So, and the people who looked at an observation. Okay, people who chewed this bark when they had a fever got well. That's science. And then they say, okay, well, let's try it. Okay, this child has got a fever. Try chewing on this, and if they see that it works, then this spreads and becomes a common practice. That is just like a drug trial. It's no different, and that's been going on for millennia. And it's how our cultures came to the advanced states that they are now. Now, science nowadays requires funding. It requires highly trained people. But it's still exactly the same kind of activity, using reason to make sense of the world, doing trials, which we call experiment, but cooks may call, oh, well, I'll try this recipe, or people working with agriculture will have a trial of this plant growing in this part of the garden. That's all science. So it's completely universal, and there is nothing specific to it, except that we're in a world that is dominated by the West at the moment. So the West does most of the science. 1,000 years ago was the Arabic world. 1,000 years before that was a Greek world, and before that it was many different places across the globe. So it is culturally dependent, and particularly modern science requires a lot of money, and only very wealthy cultures can afford to do the kind of things like build a cyclotron or other great tools and spaceships to Mars. So it is going to be dependent on those cultures, and it will carry some of those values, I guess, with it. We can't extricate science from its cultural context, but it doesn't mean that it isn't valid independent of its cultural context. As far as I can see, gravity works in every culture, and Newton discovered stuff about it that works for every single apple, whether there's an apple falling in Cambridge, in a garden in Cambridge, or an apple falling in New Zealand. It still works by the same rules. So in that sense, science is a kind of universal culture that it may be created by one culture at one time, and particular advances may be made by one culture at one time. But the great thing about it, it's available to everyone. And not only that, but the products of it are often transformative to everyone. Look, I mean, I've traveled, as I'm sure many other people have, in the developing world, going to places like Africa and India, and you can see beggars on the street with a mobile phone. Now, that gives them an enormous amount of power that they didn't actually have before. They could communicate with each other, and that is delivered by science. So, science can be liberating, and it can be liberating to everyone. Now, obviously, it costs money, and mobile phone costs money, but so do other cultural products, and we don't dismiss them as irrelevant because they do cost money.
Yeah. Can we just pause there? Something's going on with your microphone. Is it hitting something?
No, I don't think so. Microphone is
okay, because I'm getting there's when you become more animated, there's a sort of a banging sound.
Let me see if I can place it somewhere else.
Just somewhere where it's sort of stable, maybe
Yeah.
moving.
Is it still working okay here?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Okay, we'll carry on.
Yep.
Yeah, just to go, my comment about seeing beggars. I mean, I have seen beggars with mobile phones, and people who look very, very poor, and they have a mobile phone. What's interesting about that, those mobile phones have got more computing power than they had when they sent men to the moon.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's not just any old mobile phone. It's an astoundingly powerful bit of technology.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's I think it's 4 billion people in the world who have mobile phones at the moment,
and
maybe more. So it's phenomenal,
and that can be
it's emancipatory.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it could be even more emancipatory. And nothing to do with what I'm talking about today, but in my work at Surrey, we're trying to develop diagnostics, because I work on infectious diseases as well as thinking about science more generally. And we're trying to develop a diagnostic device that can do PCR. Everyone knows what PCR is these days. That can do something like PCR, but you can put onto a chip that you could plug into a mobile phone. So you could get, wherever you are in the world, you could get a PCR-like diagnosis and communicate via an app on your phone with the health service. So I think that's going to be a technology not so far away in which people are able to look after themselves better with using a phone. As anyone remember Star Trek and the tricorder that used to wave over a patient and then know exactly what was going on. Well, it's not quite tricorder, but a mobile phone is already getting there. It's when it's hooked up to these things like Fitbits and other things, it can it can diagnose COVID with quite a reasonable degree of accuracy, for example. So it's going to be there, and that is a product of technology that is becoming transformative, particularly to the lives of the poorest people. Actually, that's where it can make a big difference for people who are already well integrated into their communities, into their wider communities. It's not such a big deal. But I remember traveling in Africa many years ago when, the idea of just phoning someone wasn't available at all. Hardly anyone had phones, and technologies like PCR. We use it in infectious disease, and labs in countries like Tanzania or Ethiopia have kind of skipped the traditional way of diagnosis, which is growing things on culture plates and stuff like that, which is actually quite techy and quite complicated and requires specific facilities. Now you get a PCR machine and you can put it in a hut just an electricity supply, and it will do diagnosis of loads of stuff. And that's also transformative to often the poorest people. So science has the capability of turning things that were very expensive into cheap, um, and available. PCR, if you want your things like DNA sequencing, not that it's something that
Yeah.
would necessarily help you, but it cost about $1 billion to sequence the first human genome. They ain't get it done for about £1,000. So
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
democratizing um, influence on our lives, because ultimately it will make things cheaper. Now there is always the problem that wealthy people will grab the most effective science just as they pay for the best doctors. That happens, and they'll pay for the best musicians to come and play for them. That happens, but just because it happens in science doesn't mean that science is any has an intrinsic value only to the rich.
Yeah. Well, we're both in full agreement of the incredible power of science and what it can do, what it can do, will do, and has done for humanity. Just on that, just to be the devil's advocate, there are, the critics of science will point to the negative things that occur from scientific discoveries. We only have to look at Ukraine at the moment and see the type of weaponry that's being used and the destructive power. If we were in the Stone Ages, that we wouldn't be having such a devastating effect on each other.
Yes, but we probably wouldn't
What
be
do you
alive
think?
either. People in the
Exactly.
Stone Age didn't live
Yeah.
very long
Yeah.
because they died of infectious diseases and
Yeah.
or starvation or got eaten by a tiger or whatever. People are in a position to be as nasty as they are at the moment because they live long and they can have the power to do these things. And you can always misuse power. They misused it in the ancient world before science, and they misuse it today. Unfortunately, the power they have is much greater. But yes, science, just like the first bronze weapons allowed tyrants to murder more people than everyone else, and the first atomic bombs give people the power to do that on a global kind of scale. Yeah, that is a concern, and it's I don't know what you do about it. It's not only in science; it's in everything else. Things have got bigger and better, and but in when you invent things like the atomic bomb, which have such destructive capability, um, they will happen, and you can't undo them. Science is leading to things which are hard to control. What do you do about that? Could you unmake the knowledge that we can make atomic bombs? It didn't come out of the intention to make atomic bombs. It came out of studying fundamental physics. And then someone realized, hey, well, what happens if this and this and this goes on inside some atoms? Wouldn't that kind of create a chain reaction? And they said, yeah. And then people thought, well, couldn't that be turned into a bomb? Yes. But then great things have also, vaccines have also been created by science. And put it this way, I suppose, science has saved a lot more lives than it has destroyed, thousands of times more lives than it has destroyed through its influence on infectious disease. People live so much longer because of all the things that we um, can avoid with the products of science and technology. Yes, like everything else, it can be used destructively, but that isn't really the fault of science. It's the fault of the people who control those rockets and guns and everything else. Um, yeah, it's sad, but yeah, people do bad things to
Well,
each other,
yeah.
and if you give them a bad weapon, they'll use it.
Mm. Well, it's a cost-benefit analysis, isn't it?
Yeah.
So essentially, you're saying the benefit outweighs the costs.
Well, if you think about the average lifespan of people in Paleolithic times, it's about 30 years. Now it's about 80 years or so, 70 or 80 years. So that's 50 years of life for every 6 billion people. 6 billion people times 50 years of life have been delivered by, and it's not, we can say Paleolithic. Back in London in the 19th century, the average lifespan for working class people was about 30 years. And it's not in some very poor parts of the UK, it still is very low. And I know in many parts of the world it's still very low, but it has been increasing even in the developing world. Um, Mortality is decreasing. People are living longer. Child mortality has fallen quite dramatically in the developing world in the last few decades, and that's meant that
Well,
now there are
yeah.
millions of children alive today who wouldn't have been alive. So, yes, science can cause destruction, but it's caused longer lives, healthier lives, and happier lives. And on balance, I would say its score sheet is a lot higher than most other human activities.
Well, what I find always interesting is when you read criticisms of science, the criticisms have been written on a computer, which is a product of science.
Yeah.
So the people they don't quite see the irony. They don't get out, a stone tablet and carve their criticism into that. They
Yeah.
disseminate it across the internet, which is, one of the greatest achievements of the scientific method.
Yeah.
I, I, I thought I was going to touch on this at the end, but I think this is while we're on the subject, I'll talk about it now. So in the preamble to this podcast, I'm going to talk about the context and talk about the professor's letter about the relationship between science and mātauranga Māori. And then there was a response written by Professors Hendy and Wiles, which was signed by 2,000 others, many of them from universities from all around the world. In their final paragraph, I'll just read it to you and I'll get you to comment on it. It says, finally, they believe that mistrust of science, in quotes, is increased by this kind of critique. In contrast, we believe that mistrust in science stems from science's ongoing role in perpetuating scientific racism, justifying colonialization, and continuing support of systems that create injustice. What would your comments be to that?
I don't I don't really understand it in the sense that yes, injustices have happened, colonizations have happened, but in what way was science really collaborating on that? For example, yes, they were in the same way as shipbuilders were collaborating on colonization because shipbuilders had to make the ships that colonize that went across the oceans to, for instance, for Westerners to discover New Zealand and Australia. So are shipbuilders to blame for colonization? Of course not. Other factors are to blame for colonization. And science provides the means, just like shipbuilders provide the means for colonization, but it doesn't make them give them the. It doesn't mean that they are the cause, or they're along with many causes, but they're not the critical cause, because most people, most carpenters, do not make ships that go to colonize the world, and most scientists don't make guns or the kind of weaponry that is used to oppress people. Most scientists don't do that, but yes, some people do. You can take a violin and whack someone on the head of it with that, but it doesn't mean that the violin and musicians are inherently evil. So I think it comes from a need to blame someone and something for the ills that have happened in the world, and they certainly have happened. But science is a bystander. It's a tool that has been picked up by the people who want to oppress others. But in the past, they would have picked up an axe or a sword, and now they pick up science. Yes, that's true that science has contributed to oppression, just as it's contributed to liberation. Lots of look. I mean, I know it's kind of gone wrong more recently, but things that happened, say the Arab Spring, largely happened through social media that was made possible through science. People are communicating from Russia to telling us that they did believe in what's going on in Ukraine through science. And we can witness the terrible atrocities that are taking place in places like Ukraine through science. In the past, we wouldn't have known about them. And this is why a lot of people got away with the terrible things that they did. You know, when 1,000 years ago, William the Conqueror came and pacified England, meaning he murdered everyone who was opposed to him, no one was around to take pictures and photograph what was going on. And now all our kings and queens are descended from this guy. And yet,
Yeah.
and yet we don't blame put the blame where it lies, which is political decisions by bad people. And that's where the blame for colonization, for oppression, it's decisions made by people, not the science itself. Science is a tool, like shipbuilding, that you can use for good or you can use for ill. And that's up to people to democratically elect leaders who will try to ensure that the kind of things that cause pain, harm, and distress across the world are not the product of what their governments do, and that's what we hope democracies deliver. Science is an agent of democracy, and it's an agent of oppression, and it's an agent of everything, because just like wood is.
Yeah, well, as I always say, it's the argument against architecture. Hitler used architecture to kill 6 million Jews, so we should all be against architecture.
Yeah, the
So
Nazis.
it's not.
The Nazis marched to the tune of Wagner. Doesn't mean that Wagner was a part of the oppression. You know,
Yeah,
it's tools that tyrants will take, and that's what we had to get at. And blaming science is just missing the mark, and redirecting our energies to a false cause. And we really need to focus on what really is the problem, and it's not science.
yeah. Well, I mean, when I interviewed Jerry Coyne, I asked him these questions. So I'll ask you: in your scientific training, were you trained to be racist?
Of course
Were you
not.
trained to? No, of course not.
Well, let me just
These are
add to that.
these are stupid questions.
Yeah. But let me
But
just add
so
to that. That
yeah,
nowadays, to get you posted in universities and to interview anyone in our university, at least, and in all universities in the UK, you have to go through training to not be racist. That's the only way we're allowed now to interview students, to interview positions for posts, not only to be not racist, to not be sexist, and all the other things that we're not meant to be. And we try our best not to. But yes, there were racist scientists, just there were racist musicians and racist artists. Hitler himself was an artist. So, you know, just because Hitler was an artist doesn't mean that art is contaminated by fascism. And science
yeah,
has been used for ill, but it isn't intrinsically dangerous or
yeah.
evil.
And you've never been read or been taught or taught yourself that science is the philosophical bedrock underpinning colonization.
No.
Another silly question. No,
I
no.
mean, Karl Marx
So
was
yeah,
a great admirer of science. And and many other radical left people were also admirers of science. They saw it as a means of liberation, of liberating people from their oppressors. So yes, in the hands of powerful people, it can be used to oppress others, but it can be used to overthrow repression as well. So just as it is by the communications that social media is doing to allow people to find out what's really going on in the Ukraine at the moment.
yeah, yeah. Well, when I read that, I was to be totally honest, shocked and horrified, because these are two very prominent professors in the New Zealand scientific community, and that just makes no sense. I mean, I can't remember who said this, but it's not wrong. It's not even wrong. So okay, well that's interesting.
Pauli, I think. Pauli, I
yeah,
think.
that's right, Pauli. That's right. Yeah. So let's talk about scientific education. What are your thoughts on traditional Maori knowledge? So, just for international listeners who may not know, Maori were the first people to arrive in New Zealand approximately 700 years ago, thereabouts, before the Europeans arrived about 200 years ago. The traditional Maori knowledge is called mātauranga Maori. There's been a report which has been lauded by the current Minister of Education, stipulating or proposing that mātauranga Māori be given parity in the education system with so-called Western epistemologies or Western knowledge. And it includes quite a damning sentence in the report about how science has been used to oppress indigenous peoples and the Maori culture in particular, and basically suggesting that an inquiry into the negative impacts of science should be held in the scientific classroom in the secondary school curriculum. I'm not sure of what is the specifics of what is being proposed, whether they're going to be teaching particular aspects of mātauranga Māori in the science classroom. But what are your comments about what I would say non-scientific material being taught and promoted in the science classroom?
I think people's culture is very, very important to them. I'm Irish. I was born in Ireland, but brought up in England, and Irish culture was suppressed by the English for hundreds of years. So now it's hard to find people in Ireland who speak Irish. It is in the West, you still find people, but it's hard to find. So the culture was suppressed. But we don't want to in Ireland. We don't want to have classes about leprechauns in science. It's not really appropriate. Yes, we value our folk culture. We value those tales of leprechauns and fairies and spirits in the night that would take a child away and all of that kind of stuff. And there are lots of stories in Irish literature. They seem to have had in Irish folklore. They seem to have had a belief that conception could be through eating a fly or a mosquito or something that got into your mouth and you could conceive. But now Irish women do not use mosquito nets as contraception. They use condoms. And condoms and the pill are products of science. And we suffered or Irish people suffered under the yoke of a tyrannical religion, Roman Catholicism, for hundreds of years. And many countries still do. And I think that is something that is wrong, and it created a lot of suffering, as well as, I was brought up as a Roman Catholic. I know the comfort that religion brings to many people, and Maori culture, I'm sure, is extremely important to many, many people in Australia. And
New Zealand. Sorry, I'm going to have to pick you up on that. New Zealand, not Australia.
Oh yes, sorry, yeah. I do apologize.
That's all right.
I do apologize.
You've made the classic faux pas.
I have.
Yeah. Anyway, carry on. Yeah, that's all right.
But yes, in New Zealand culture, in Maori culture, I'm sure, is very important to many people, and just as Irish culture is important. But we celebrate it by, St. Patrick's Day in a couple of days' time, will drink Guinness, sing miserable songs about loss and being oppressed by the English and that kind of thing. And Irish literature now doesn't really is mostly written in English, and we have an English way of an Irish way of writing novels, and so Irishness is still alive and well, but it's a different thing than it was hundreds of years ago, and we can't get back that thing that we lost. And I'm sure Maori people do hanker after the thing that they lost, the great expanse of their culture, and they want to hold very hard on what they still have, and that's right for them to hold very hard to it. But don't turn it into a science. It doesn't fit. It's part of culture, just like sad songs are part of Irish culture, and we don't turn them into a science. Science, as I describe it, is where you get rid of anything that you don't need to explain the world. And just as I can get rid of fairies to and still provide a perfectly adequate account of the world, so I'm sure that maybe, and I still find stories of fairies fun and great and all the rest of it. I'm sure Maori culture also has stuff in it which you could get rid of in order to explain the world, and this is really where science comes in. It says, okay, let's get rid of everything we don't need and see what's left, and then make our technologies out of those bits. And that has been an extraordinarily powerful approach. It's what's built technology. You get rid of the stuff like in the Middle Ages, people believed all sorts of things about how machines work, and when they started, when Newton put equations on them, then they could really turn them into technologies that ultimately took men to the moon and many other achievements. So, and that is what science does. You get rid of the stuff that you don't need to explain a phenomenon, and then you're left with something you could then turn into the language of mathematics and write mathematical equations with, and use them to make predictions about, how much fuel you need to put in a rocket to get to the moon. You can't do that with folklore. And valuable though folklore is to people's psychology, to people's feeling of well being, it's not going to get you to the moon. It's not necessarily going to make more food, and it's not necessarily going to cure diseases. It might do. There are certainly folklore medicines that work, but most of them don't. And you're better off going to a Western doctor. So those things are products of science, and like them or not, they are successful. I often point out that people who believe in stuff like say telepathy, they might have conferences on telepathy, but they'll call each other by phone, not by telepathy to arrange the date. They'll travel in cars and aeroplanes, not on flying carpets. So the science is kind of proved not through its logic. And this is where people get it wrong. They think that you can prove science through logic. No, you can't. It's ultimately proved by the fact that it works, by the fact that your mobile phone works, the fact that rockets work, the fact that vaccines have saved millions of people's lives. Those are real products of science, and we can show them in the people who are alive today who would otherwise be dead. And that is what science really depends on. Its value for making people's lives happier, healthier, live longer, and have healthier children. And that's what science delivers. Sadly, hundreds of years of folklore about fairies and leprechauns, etc., didn't deliver that to Ireland. And although we're still happy to for people to believe in this stuff, when we drive our cars, we turn in the ignition and science kicks in.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good segue to move on to William of Occam and your
Mhm.
book, Life is Simple. So, do you want to talk about William of Occam? I've been fascinated to read your book and listen to your lectures about him. I always knew about Occam's Razor, but I didn't realize the significance of it. and really how it seems that Occam may be the beginning of the true scientific method. So anyway, tell us about Occam, William of Occam.
I came to him when I knew about as much as you do. Occam's Razor I'd heard of, and principle of simplicity. Yeah, okay, that's useful. And I got a job at the University of Surrey, and a colleague of mine in an area of science called systems biology came and gave a talk on biology has no need for Occam's Razor, or Occam's Razor should be banned from biology. And I kind of thought, I'm not sure if I go along with that. And I remembered that on my driving to work, I passed a road sign for Occam, and I thought, is there anything to do with this guy, this person who invented the razor? So I did a bit of internet searching that night. I discovered, yes, it was. William of Ockham was born in this local Surrey village in the 13th century, and we don't really know anything about him other than he was born around that time. We don't know his family, or we know he was given to the Franciscan order, and that could mean he was abandoned on their doorstep, or might have been a illegitimate child, or an orphan. And he was
And we're talking we're talking 1388, aren't we? When he was born.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
No, we're talking about 12. He was 1300.
Sorry, 1288. Sorry, yes.
1288.
Yeah,
1288.
1288. So
We
a
always
long
get
time ago.
confused by 13th century, 12th century,
Yeah.
13th century, 1300s, 1200s. But yeah, 1288,
Yeah.
around then. And given to the Franciscan order, they educated him, sent him to Oxford to study theology. And theology at the time, in the 13th, 14th century, was called the Queen of Sciences. And that was the first thing that intrigued me. Science is theology. And I thought, sorry, that can't be right. But anyway, it was. And it was down to a man called Thomas Aquinas, who St. Thomas Aquinas in the Catholic Church, who imported Aristotle's science into the Western tradition, into the modern Western tradition, and used it to, so he claimed, prove God, prove the existence of God in 5 different ways. And William of Ockham came along in about 1320 or so. He went to Oxford and studied Aquinas and other philosophers around at the time, and said, no, this is nonsense. You can't prove God. And he used his razor, this principle that you've got to take the simplest solutions for everything, to disprove all of Aquinas's, not all with the razor, but other methods of reason and logic, to disprove all of Aquinas's 5 proofs of God, and make a statement that I think is the first time this statement has been made clearly in the entire world. He said that science and religion are completely separate. Science is based on reason, religion is based on faith. I believe he was the first person in the history of the world to make that statement clearly. And I'm astonished no one knows his name, hardly. But he was the first person, and that is surely the first step towards modern science, secular science, of course. Science has got to be secular because you've got to get rid of all of the stuff that, as I was saying before, you don't need in explanations. And whether you believe in him or not, God isn't needed to explain anything in this world. So William of Ockham was the first person to make that statement, and he used his razor in his logic to really dismiss most of metaphysics, and made and really demolished the scholastic view, as it was called at the time, of trying to fuse science and religion. William of Ockham said, "There you go."
Can we just sort of stop on that point,
Yeah, sure.
to just really drill home how important that separation between church, religion, and science is? Why was it so important? What was the problem with the connection or the melding of those two systems?
Well, if you believe, as people in the medieval world believe, that the moon is pushed around by an angel, then you don't need gravity. You don't need any other explanation. William of Ockham was the first person to say, no, angels, we can't see them. They don't do anything that shows their presence. So we have to get rid of them in our explanations of science. Now he was a Catholic Franciscan, so he, as far as we know, he died a believer in God. But he pointed out that the stuff on Earth we don't need to have supernatural explanations for. He didn't dismiss the possibility of miracles or stuff like that, but he said that really, when you want to make sense of the world, which is what we do with science, you've got to get rid of them. And then, for example, only while Occam was still alive, Occamist philosophers in Paris, and Nicholas Oresme and others came up with the idea that well, one of the things that's kind of complicated in the world is when you look at the sky at night, everything rotates. Everything rotates around the Earth, and that had been explained in ancient philosophies by everything rotating around the Earth. That's obvious. That's what they're doing. And these French Occamist philosophers said, well, actually, wouldn't it be simpler if the Earth rotated and everything stood still? And that's the first step towards modern astronomy, and astronomy is the first step towards modern science. Just saying that the Earth stood still and you could make a complicated system of loads of objects moving in the sky much simpler. And then when Copernicus took up this idea a couple of hundred years later, he used exactly the same arguments as Occamist arguments, that he claimed his system. So Copernicus accepted what the Paris Occamists had already shown, that you can make sense of the motions of most of the objects in the sky just by allowing the Earth to spin, and that makes a lot more sense because it's simpler. Not because it makes more sense, because it's simpler. And but Copernicus discovered that if he shifted the center of all of the rotations in the solar system away from the Earth and to the Sun, then all of the motions in the heavens became simpler still. And he argued then for the heliocentric solar system rather than the geocentric system. And his only argument then was that it was simpler. It didn't argue that it made better predictions, because it didn't at the time, than the geocentric system that an ancient astronomer called Ptolemy. He had worked out a system of predicting the motions in the heavens with a very complicated equations and geometric diagrams, which he could do because you can make sense of complex systems if you're clever enough, and he could predict the motions of the heavens in a geocentric system. But Copernicus showed you can make life a lot easier if you could switch to saying that the sun is at the center. And although it didn't make any better predictions, it just made more sense. For example, if you tried to make sense of the motion of Jupiter or Saturn in the geocentric system, you had to account for why they had a particular cycle in their motion of a year, of the Earth year. Now, why should a planet wobble around in the sky with an Earth year in it? It just doesn't make any sense. But Copernicus pointed out, well, actually, if you put the sun in the center, then that wobble goes, because that wobble is caused by the motion of the Earth around the sun. And once you get rid of that by placing the sun at the center, then you get rid of that wobble. So it makes it simpler. It makes the whole thing simpler and make more sense. And once it makes more sense, you have a fewer components to work with. You know, if you try to make sense of the geocentric system, which you can do, under general relativity, it's perfectly valid to take the Earth as the center of your system. And you can do it, but the equations are very complicated because you've got to put the motion of the Earth, instead of the Earth moving, you've got to translate the motion into every planet, every sun, every star has got to have that motion. So it makes it very, very complicated, but doable. And what science?
You have to over account.
Yeah, exactly. You over account it in a trillion other motions of objects in the heavens. So, which doesn't make sense. But the problem with that is the equations are so complex, you can't see anything simpler still. And when Kepler took the Copernican system, there were still some complications in it, but because it was already simplified, he could say, okay, we can get rid of these extra complications by allowing the orbits to be elliptical rather than circular, as in Copernicus' system. And then he came up with a modern solar system, pretty much as we see it today. But he wouldn't have been able to see that with a Ptolemaic system, the earlier complicated one. It's just too hard. There are too many motions. Once you make things simpler, you can see sense. You can see some other solution that will get you nearer to the truth. And every subsequent advance in science has been through some kind of simplification. So this principle of finding the simplest solution has been so powerful in science. And the first person to really point this out, that should be the linchpin of science, was William of Occam. So he did two fantastic things for science. One, he separated it from religion. He didn't say religion was wrong. He said, well, when you do science, you've got to get rid of it. Two, he developed the principle of simplicity to say that science is really about just finding the simplest solutions. And those are the two bedrocks of modern science.
Yeah. So when you simplify things, you can see further.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's sort of the analogy that comes to mind as a very dirty window. Sure, you can see through it, but once you clean it, you can see through it with higher fidelity, and that can scale because the next person can see further, and the next person can see further.
Yeah.
So you make advances faster. They just explain what I found fascinating about your book, which I wasn't aware of. Explain the medieval mind, because I think I see there's an analog between the medieval thinking and traditional indigenous knowledge, which both sort of are premised not on a scientific full scientific understanding of the world and scientific methodologies, but more on mythologies, which are sort of narratives and made up stories. So one thing I found absolutely fascinating that I didn't know was they viewed the stars as the gates of heaven.
Yeah. And I think there is a temptation in that to kind of say, okay, these people in the medieval world or in other cultures or in older cultures were a bit dumb and hadn't worked things out properly. No, they came up with the best explanations that they could find. So they saw that objects on the ground that move require someone to move them, and they saw objects in the sky that moved, and they thought, well, someone must be moving them, and they called those someone's gods or angels or demons or whatever else. So they tried to make sense of the world with the stuff that was necessary to explain the world around them. So in a way, they were being scientific at the time. They were using the minimum set of pieces to try to make sense of the world. But as science progresses, you see there are simpler ways of doing science. And yes, the medieval world had this view. It is an extraordinary one when we think about it today, and I don't know how far whether it would correspond to, say, how Maori people would have thought about the world in the pre-Western New Zealand. But yes, they thought the heavens were a surface, and essentially the walls of, they were called the heavens. Where does that come from? It's because people looked up and they thought heaven, the place where they're going to go when they die, is up above their heads. And behind the starry firmament, this was thought to be the wall of heaven, was God. And if they could somehow pull it apart, they could look in and see the angels and the saints and the face of God. It was up there. Just as beneath them was hell, the place that they would go to if they were good people. So their aim in life was to do the deeds that they needed to do to ensure that when they died, they went up rather than down. And it really had that geographical aspect to it, that it was going up was a good thing, going down was definitely a bad thing. So their world was kind of saturated with this worldview of theology. Theology was everywhere, and it was full of
So
things.
theology and mythology,
Yeah, they're
in a
both
sense.
the same thing, really, aren't they? I mean, theology
Yeah.
is about God
Yeah.
and God's mythology. This is, I
Yeah.
think, in anything in cultural studies, we at least there used to be there was this separation. Oh, there's religion, and then there's cultural studies about mythology and stuff. No, it's all mythology, and the mythologies of the Maori people has just as much validity as the mythologies of the Catholic Church or Muslim world or whatever else. So they all have equal validity, but they operate in a different sphere to science. So, and this is really what Occam did in the medieval world. He was actually the first person. He had a line. It's in my book. Can't remember how it goes exactly, but it is. I find no reason to believe that the sky above is any different from the world below. So he was already saying, actually, we should be trying to explain the stuff above our heads with the same kind of laws that we use for the stuff below our feet. And that then leads indirectly, but to Newton, who then found that he could use the same law of gravity to explain an apple falling from a tree as the planet Mars traveling around the sun and Venus and our own Earth. And that was an extraordinary simplification. Suddenly, you could explain both the heavens and the earth in a single system. And this is what
And an apple.
and an apple that the same that the moon going around the earth and the sun going around the earth is delivered by the same force that pulls an apple off a tree and can be described by the same equations. That is extraordinary. And it is certainly one of the most important advances in science to know that the world above us still operates by the same rules. So in the medieval world, the world above was heaven, and it was made of a different element, and it was completely unlike what was down below because it was heaven. It was the place where where God and the angels lived, and that must have been very strange looking up and seeing the place where you thought you were going to go to when you die up in the sky. I don't know. I'd be intrigued to know whether Maori people have a similar kind of belief of where they're going to go in traditional Maori culture, and whether it was somewhere where they could see, like the heavens were.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The other thing to finish off with is the importance of freedom of speech and freedom of thought, and what I just read last night from your book, what William of Ockham said about that. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, so I'd give you a little bit more history of William of Ockham. So he did all these things while he was working at Oxford. And then he was accused of heresy, of teaching heresy at Oxford. So he then had to travel to Avignon to answer before the Pope. You know, heresy, big deal. You can end up on a burning pyre for heresy. So it was an important trial that he was going to, but it took a while. These trials, it took several years, and he got mixed up in a conflict then between the Pope and the Franciscans about whether it was holy to be poor, intrinsically holy to be poor. The Franciscans said yes, it was. The Pope said no, I'm the wealthiest man in the world and I'm very holy. So he got involved in this controversy and ended up accusing the Pope of being a heretic and then having to flee Avignon, chased by a posse of Vatican soldiers, and eventually found refuge with the Holy Roman Emperor, who was crowning his own pope in Rome at the time. So he has an interesting history as well. But he was a supporter of the right of people to dissent, and he particularly argued that statements made in physics, which was the only science really around at the time, the statements made in physics do not need to um, follow religious rules, that physicists, scientists essentially at the time should be free to say what they want. And that, I think, is also one of the foundations of modern science. Of course, it didn't happen overnight. Galileo was still put under house arrest for saying that the Earth was not at the center of the universe. But eventually,
And Giordano Bruno was burnt at the stake for
exactly.
saying the universe was infinite.
Yeah, he did say a lot of other things, actually.
Did he?
His mistake apparently. So I've read a little bit more about him. His mistake was drawing a horoscope of Jesus, which was kind of saying then that Jesus was subject to astrological laws. So that was definitely not allowed.
Right.
Jesus was meant to be God, and the person who made all the laws.
So he obviously deserved to be burnt at the stake.
He cost a lot of people, not just because of his astronomical views, but at that time you could be put on the stake for your views.
It was life and death.
It was, and William of Occam, if he had been found guilty of heresy, he would have either had to recant, which he could have done, and probably got away with it. But if he didn't recant, and he was a very stubborn man, so I'm not sure if he would have ended up burnt. So that's what happened. And sadly, it's still, people still control views. I mean, we know around the world, people's views are controlled in various countries where you're not allowed to say what you think. And if you do, you may not be burnt at the stake, but you may end up in prison. So sadly, that is still not true today.
And we have what I call digital burning at the stake, where if you hold heretical views, which these scientists who have written the In Defence of Science letter seem to have, their views seem to be heretical at the moment in New Zealand. You're up for being burnt at the digital stake. We'll be pounded on by thousands of messages on digital media saying that you're not a very nice person and you shouldn't be doing X, Y, Z. And people can lose their jobs, and it can be much more subtle than that. They can just be quietly demoted or not promoted. A whole range of techniques. And I may be misconstruing this, but I don't think I am. But this seems to be the environment we're moving into in this day and age, where there is such a thing as heretical speech. I always love the saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And there seems to be an analogue there. So just to conclude, freedom of speech and freedom of thought is fundamental, not only for our society, but in particular for science. You couldn't do science without the freedom of thought.
No, absolutely not. Science requires everyone to be exactly as Occam said. That scientists have to be free to say what they please, say what they like, even if it's wrong. And most science is wrong at some time. All science becomes wrong because you find some other theory that will explain things better. So you've got to be free to be wrong and say daft things. There are many scientists who will say stupid things. And we have a lot of problems in all countries now with an increasing intolerance of views that we don't like, and I think that is a poisonous kind of way that we're going, where we're intolerant of views. And surely, places like the internet and on TV and radio and all these media, we should be free to say what we like. If our arguments are not sufficient to persuade people of the truth that we believe we are able to defend, like science, then they're not good enough. But to ban people who, for example, who say that science is rubbish, I would never ban them. I would argue against them, and that I would hope that would be in the other direction as well. Don't ban people who think differently from you. Show that they're wrong, and that's really the challenge to people who believe that science is needs correcting in some way, and it needs to be admonished. tell us where we're wrong. Don't ban us. That's how science, and not only science, but culture progresses. And I think that's what we have to aim for, that everyone should be free to say what they wish and then be admonished and then be corrected or then be persuaded. Tell us why we're wrong, not ban us. That's really the worst way forward in science. And we're going back to the medieval world then. We're going back to the people who accused Occam of heresy because he disproved Aquinas' proofs of God and other things. But we're going back to that world, and that isn't a good world to be in.
Well, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today, Johnjoe.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.